Mervyn Peake, best known as the author of the Gormenghast trilogy, ended up behind these walls. He was 46 and had lost his mind. The remaining 11 years of his life were spent incarcerated in psychiatric homes and hospitals, suffering from a degenerative neurological disease.
Maeve, never, never again. It has done something to me, or rather, it has frightened me a bit to be under the same roof with those in other wards, some of them. Perhaps it's because I have played too much round the edge of madness. Oh, I could cry to be free. I will never write about mad people again.
He was at the Priory in Roehampton Lane, but he was also in hideous places like Friar Barnet, where I saw him in a cell. To see your father in a cell, you've got to have guts to look at it and walk out, biting your tongue as hard as you can.
Gormenghast, that is the main massing of the original stone, taken by itself would have displayed a certain ponderous architectural quality, were it possible to have ignored the circumfusion of those mean dwellings that swarmed like an epidemic around its outer walls. They sprawled over the sloping earth, each one halfway over its neighbour, until, held back by the castle ramparts, the innermost of these hovels laid hold on the great walls, clamping themselves thereto like limpets to a rock.
He was never in the fashion. Even when he was very highly praised, he was always outside whatever was going on, whatever was the recognized literary trend of the time. To my mind, this is what makes him, in a strange way, a genius, that he simply forged his own way, paid no attention to other people, and created something which is unique to himself. But by doing so, he put himself right outside the literary village, because they simply didn't know what to make of him.
He used to say, to me most days when I was young, which means 1 to 10, and now I'll tell you again, you're a very naughty little boy, which is what it means. So that was one little thing he used to say, but he used to speak a lot of Chinese at home.
Peake had a strange start in life. His father was a doctor who ran a missionary hospital in China, where Peake was born in 1911. The first 12 years of Peake's life sowed the seeds of a bizarre and unique imaginative inner world.
I would have thought that there was a strong possibility that his being particularly interested in the operations that Dr. Peake carried out, in which he was often looking, he used to watch from the students' gallery, amputations, all kinds of Asiatic diseases. I think there's a combination of the interest in the medical ghoulishness, inquisitiveness, and the aspects of primordial Chinese life that never seemed to stop and went on, this fascination that they have with dates and the significance of dates when in juxtaposition to other dates. On the 3rd day of the 4th month, when the such and such emperor had his 5th child, it was on the 8th day. This is a recurring leitmotif in a lot of my father's work.
The left-hand pages were headed with the date, and in the first of the 3 books this was followed by a list of the activities to be performed hour by hour during the day by his lordship, the exact times, the garments to be worn for each occasion, and the symbolic gestures to be used. Diagrams facing the left-hand page gave particulars of the routes by which his lordship should approach the various scenes of operation. If, for instance, his lordship's sepulchrave, the present Earl of Groan, had been 3 inches shorter, the costumes, gestures, and even the routes would have differed from the ones described in the first tome, and from the enormous library another volume would have had to have been chosen which would have applied.
Even as a young boy, Peake was unusually gifted at both writing and drawing. By the age of 10, he was writing and illustrating his own articles for a missionary magazine. Throughout his life, his imagination continued to take shape as readily in pictures as in words, rooted always in his early experiences in China.
Out of the overlapping leaves of my brain came tapping, tapping, a voice that is not mine alone, nor can the woodpecker claim it as his own. The flicker deep in the foliage belongs to neither birds, men, or dreams. It is as far away as childhood seems.
Having excelled at drawing and sport at school back in England, Peake went on to study art at the Royal Academy schools in London, but left after only 1 year to join an artists' colony on the tiny island of Sark in the Channel Islands.
It is romantic. It really is. And of course it's beautiful and frightening. Really frightening. The trees, they're grotesque. They get chopped off by the winds and they form these incredible shapes. I think it's almost sort of, you get a feeling of evil over the Bois des Ogeries, over the Goulier. Some places on the island are very, very frightening. And you could crash to your death with just like that.
It's very different to go back over all these years, you know, but I remember him as a very handsome young man, and they were all, quite a few of them here at the time, as all artists, writers and painters. And they, while they were here, they built the art gallery, which is now the post office, and it was quite an art gallery. There was a lot of lovely people here at the time, all like him, sort of bohemian, and charming with it. But he wasn't married then. He was quite a young man, in his early 20s, and I was around about 20, I suppose. Of course, there's a long way to go back. And I don't actually know what he was doing. I don't know if he was an artist or if he was a writer. Never knew at that time what he was doing. I don't know which he did, you know.
And what did he wear? What did he look like?
Well, he was arty crafty. He looked like the picture on Sandeman's Port with his great big black cape and a sombrero, you know, and he looked the part. That was the way he sort of flashed around Sark, which is very different to what Sark was used to, of course.
This one is a portrait of a Sarkese man in the 30s, and I think the hands are probably almost purposefully modelled on Van Gogh hands, you know, those like the and the pose is rather like the postman, you know, the famous Van Gogh postman, whose hands are sort of like they're sort of rather gnarled.
In the early 30s, Peake and his contemporaries became known as the Sark Group. Work from their gallery was shown in London, where Peake, aged only 22, already had a reputation as a commercially successful painter.
I think the Queen Mother bought 1 or 2 of them. Who else, I don't know, but naturally the Queen Mother, having bought 1 or 2 of his paintings, well, interested in everybody, because if she approved of them, then it was worthwhile, you know, it was, if they caught her eye.
I never saw him painting myself, but my father-in-law did, when in the 30s this is, and he used to see Mervyn on the headland just south of Jaspellery. Apparently he painted in the nude, but he always wore a sombrero hat. That's all I know. No, I never saw him painting. I never even saw him drawing.
The island was divided by what they called a coupe, which was an enormously steep both sides, leading to a little filament of cliff between the 2 islands. And he climbed down the side you didn't have a path down. Terribly dangerous. I mean, it was crumbling limestone. Came up, we were there, howling with laughter, and there'd been a baby cormorant stuffed down his shirt, doing all sorts of smelly and disgusting things down his trousers. And he kept it as a pet. It squirted all over the studio and made a mess of his canvases. But it was typical of him in a way. He was very athletic.
Mervyn Peake began teaching at Westminster College of Art in 1936, and he met Maeve Gilmore, his future wife, who was then a sculpture student. You saw me standing alone. When the two families first met, the Gilmores were rather horrified by Mervyn Peake, who was this very flamboyant young man with a great deal of hair and an earring and things like this, a rather striking appearance. And Maeve Gilmore was his recollections of her were that she was extremely shy, very withdrawn, very quiet, very beautiful young woman. You heard me saying a prayer.
It was an incredibly romantic marriage, as far as I could see, and I have the letters from my father to my mother right from the beginning of their relationship, and incredibly romantic and loving and sweet and very respectful of each other and incredibly supportive of each other as artists.
Well, she was 5'6". She was blonde. She had technically an extremely good shape. She had wonderful legs. I'd like to meet a woman in my life who had legs like that. I don't think I could continue life. In fact, I think I'd prefer to go out with trunk tree women, and then I'll never be in a position of comparing them. So she was a sort of personification. This is the man talking, isn't it? Do you ask any man what he thinks of his mother, unless she had a hair lip and I don't know, some strange impediment. Most men think about their mothers as being near perfect, don't they? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
The early days of married life were happy times. Peake was continually drawing, and before long his first illustrated book was published. Captain Slaughterboard Drops Anchor was a children's story about a pirate and his companion, the yellow creature.
Maeve Peake, I remember, said that she had been told that the yellow creature looked like her, and she regarded this as an insult. The whole world of Captain Slaughterboard is a nostalgic look back at the paradisal qualities of Sark, where your island gives you a self-enclosed space which is completely under your control and which observes no exterior rules.
The enclosed edifice of Arundel Castle was another distinctive location to imprint itself on Peake's mental landscape. At the outbreak of war, he moved a pregnant Maeve down to Sussex, close to his own parents.
The crumbling castle, looming among the mists, exhaled the season, and every cold stone breathed it out. The tortured trees by the dark lake burned and dripped, and their leaves, snatched by the wind, were whirled in wild circles through the towers. The clouds mouldered as they lay coiled, or shifted themselves uneasily upon the stone skyfield, sending up wreaths that drifted through the turrets and swarmed up the hidden walls.
It was while Peake was in the army, stationed at various barracks around England, that he started writing the first of the Gormenghast books, Titus Groan, as an escape from the tedium and pettiness of army life. Filling notebooks with writing, drawing and doodles, he would send each completed chapter home to Maeve, now mother of Sebastian.
One of the extraordinary things about Titus Groan is the sense of absolute authority from the first line, really. Gormenghast, that is the main massing of the original stone. I mean, you feel the presence of this building, And what Peake has done is played the trick of referring to it as though it exists already out there in our imaginations before the narrative starts.
He had this Olympian vision, crammed with detail at the same time, and he managed to keep all these little subplots going and all mesh around the big plot of Gormenghast itself and what happens to the Groan dynasty, a lot of which is generated by Steerpike, the baddie. And it's Steerpike who moves things forward the whole time. He's the one who wants to corrupt the whole castle and become its dictator in the end. So he starts off killing people. There's murder after murder after murder, and nobody realises that he's behind it all.
I am death, he cried. I am all who have died. I am the death of twins. Behold, look at my face. It is naked, it is bone, it is revenge. Listen, I am the one who strangles.
The force and the power of Peake, in my view, is that tremendous imagination that he has. I mean, nobody, I think, has pushed the imaginative barriers so far back. And the beauty of it also is in the language. He did the most extraordinary things with language. He was able to write whole chapters which were pure description. Nothing really happening except perhaps a bat flying across some scenery. But he was able to imbue it with the most extraordinary images and feeling of life. There's something incredibly alive about Peake and dangerous.
When I read Titus Groan, it was as I expected. It was exactly like his pictures. It was, I don't think he knew it was grim. I think he thought it was enchanted. But it all turned out to be sinister, strange. But that was the way he was.
The manservant, who's a great old character, who creaks around the whole castle because his knee is that way inclined, is not oiled, and he ends up having this dreadful fight with the chef, who's the most enormously fat man with these bloody knives that he's constantly sharpening.
Across his face, little billows of flesh ran swiftly here and there until, as though they had determined to adhere to the same impulse, they swept up into both oceans of soft cheek, leaving between them a vacuum, a gaping segment like a slice cut from a melon. It was horrible. It was as though nature had lost control, as though the smile as a concept, as a manifestation of pleasure, had been a mistake. For here on the face of Swelter, the idea had been abused.
Luckily, it's the fat chef who dies, and he is dragged out to the mantled tower, the Tower of the Owls, in this incredible garden. And there he is sacrificed to the owls by Lord Groan, who has come to believe that he too is an owl, which is why he sits on the mantelpiece in the drawing room, begging the rest of the family for mice and titbits.
Some twigs, Mr. Flay, some twigs at once. Twigs of all sizes, do you understand? From small branches downwards in size, every kind of shape, Flay, every kind of shape, for I shall study each in turn and understand the twigs I build with, for I must be as clever as the others with my twigs, though we are careless workmen. What are you waiting for, Mr. Flay? Flay looks up. He has been unable to keep his eyes on the transformed aspect of his master, but now he lifts them again. He can recognize no expression. The mouth might as well not be there. The fine aquiline nose appears to be more forceful, and the saucer-like shape of the eyes hold within either sky a vacant moon.
Shortly after writing about Sepulchre's madness, Peake himself suffered his first nervous breakdown. He spent 7 months in a military hospital and was eventually invalided out of the army. Remarkably, despite his depression, Peake, now the father of 2 sons, was earning his living by working as an illustrator.
He was the greatest illustrator that England had ever known. He got all
When you're an illustrator in England, you have the same books given to you that every other illustrator has had. Alice in Wonderland, The Hunting of the Snark, all the children's books, all the fairy stories are given to you to illustrate. And they complained that they wanted more pretty princesses and less ugly ogres. But of course Mr. Peake thought they were pretty princesses.
How many nurseries you may have appalled is another matter. How many scandalized parents may have written to you, possibly enclosing doctors' and neurologists' bills, you will probably not disclose. Anyhow, most other illustrated books for children look just silly by comparison.
He had a wonderful way, a really remarkable way, of changing the direction of his lines so that you would get this sort of thing built up. There would be, say, rocks or waves, and here you have the sun, and by these walls, and if you look there too, there are, as it walls of line, and they make the thing very, very evocative. He's extremely good at that. Not many people are.
At certain points, things would get worked on so much that they got too black or filled in, and he would nowadays you perhaps people might use Tipex to get back to stage one again so that they could rework it, but occasionally he used white, like white poster paint or something like that, but a lot of the time he worked with the side of a razor blade, and I remember him actually, going like this on the surface, so the whole surface might, on some of the illustrations, has really got very heavily indented and clogged up with sort of its own paper, really, but then it was reworked again.
I wish to recommend Mr. Mervyn Peake as a draftsman of great distinction, who might be most suitably employed in war records. Augustus John.
He finally obtained commission as a war artist in 1945, very late in the war, and he went out with a journalist called Tom Pocock and visited Belsen some weeks after it had already been liberated. He only went there for one day, but found the experience shocking and lasting, and did a number of drawings which later became the basis for figures in the novel called Titus Alone. He'd been attracted before to skeletal and horrific figures, and we know that from his illustrations to The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It's almost as though in Belsen, Peake found in the external world evidence for what had been going on in his imagination beforehand, I think. I mean, there is a very, very dark, macabre side to Peake's imagination, and I think that Belsen brought him up short because of the evidence of what human cruelty meant in reality, actually.
When Mervyn and I were going to Hamburg, we passed Belsen concentration camp, which had been liberated by the army a few weeks earlier, in the last weeks of the war. Now, I had been there earlier, not on the first days, but very soon after, when it was still very horrible. And I knew that subsequently the prison huts had been burned down and the surviving prisoners had been moved into the German barracks, which had been converted into hospitals. And I'm ashamed to say I thought, well, there was no need for me to go. I'd seen it. I let Mervyn go. So I made an excuse, and I believed it myself. And I said I would spend a day by a rather beautiful lake not far away, and I would drop Mervyn off at Belsen, which I did. I left him there in the morning, and he went through there's a gap in the barbed wire, and he went through there, and I didn't see him again till evening.
The wraith he had brought with him had been washed and put to bed, but had died the moment her head had touched the snowy pillow.
he sat at the end of a squalid, desperately squalid bed, on which a Jewish girl was dying. When I say girl, I think probably 28, 30. And he thought, how could, afterwards, he thought, how could I have sat there drawing, dispassionately drawing, this eternal creature as she died?
I can't, he thought. I can't sustain her, I can't comfort her, I can't love her. Her suffering is far too clear to see. There is no veil across it, no mystery, no romance. Nothing but a factual pain, like the pain of a nagging tooth. Again he turned his eyes to her as though to verify what he had been thinking, and at once he was ashamed. She had become emptied. Pain had emptied her. There was nothing left. What could he do?
I think the trip to Bilson affected my father tremendously, and I don't think he ever recovered from it. He wasn't able to talk to my mother at all about it when he came back. He wrote about it in letters, and then never referred to it again.
In 1946, Titus Groan was published and attracted an admiring but small readership. The following year, wanting to recapture a happy past, Peake returned with his family to Sark.
What type of person do you think likes to live on
Odd, unless you're a native. Yeah, we're all slightly like limpets clinging to a rock.
The Peake family spent 3 years in Sark, where Claire was born in 1949. Peake was still being commissioned as an illustrator, and during this time produced drawings for Treasure Island, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the Swiss Family Robinson. His writing flourished too. On Sark, Peake wrote Gormenghast, the second of the Titus books. When it was published in 1951, it won the prestigious Royal Society of Literature Award.
About the rough margins of the castle life, margins irregular as the coastline of a squall-rent island, there were characters that stood or moved gradually to the central hub.
There's a wonderful scene where Steerpike's gone to the far end of the castle to dispose of the bodies of the twins, Cora and Clarice, who he's murdered. And he's murdered them by leaving them immured in a room without any provisions. And he goes there with his pet monkey, who's called Satan. And he arrives there. Unbeknownst to him, he's being stalked by Titus Flay and Dr. Prunesquire, watching him from a distance. And he knows the room where the bodies are is booby-trapped. So what he does is he makes the monkey go in first. And all that they see, Titus Flay and Prunesquire, or hear rather, is this horrific human scream. And it's the monkey. And what's happened, of course, is that the axe has landed, cut off its tail. And you see this terrible, terrible scene of the monkey rushing round, gibbering, bluttering everywhere, its tail cut off.
This one brings out the more macabre element of his approach to painting, and I think probably has some kind of reference to Goya, who was one of his most favourite artists. I don't actually like this painting very much myself, but I wanted to put it in order to show a cross-section.
Her eyes were narrowed. Did you not have to crawl across the coupe, the high knife edge? How else could you have returned? I did, said Titus. That is how I came. From the North Headstones? Is that what it is called, Mother? It is. You have been in the North Headstones beyond Gorey and the Silver Mines. I know where you've been. You've been to the Twin Fingers, where Little Sark begins and the bluff narrows. Between the twins would be water now, am I right? There's what looks like a bay, said Titus, if that's what you mean.
So what kind of a family is it that's living in Gormenghast?
Immensely dysfunctional. But dysfunctional in a beautiful sort of way. I mean, they're all mad, they're all eccentric. They're caricatures. They're great caricatures. They're husks, in a way, because what they're doing is they're vehicles for Peake's humour. And I think the amount of humour in those novels should never be underestimated. I mean, it's absolutely dancing away with playful ideas and playful images. But the whole idea of Titus growing up with a father who's dead, pecked to death by owls, a mother who doesn't like children and sees him about twice a year, a sister who is first insanely jealous of him and then very possessively loving of him, and then who is driven away from him again by Steerpike, twin aunts who go mad and are incarcerated in a tower, again by the evil Steerpike. I mean, how much more dysfunctional can you possibly get? And yet it works beautifully, and we recognise people in it, we recognise ourselves in it.
Yeah, I can remember him working, writing, drawing all the time. He was always in his studio or in his writing room doing something. So that was my whole memory, always working. And the other thing is I was able to go in at any point to his studio and to his writing room and interrupt him and sit on his lap and hear a story, or him just chat to me, or we play a game. There was never any precious behaviour about, Daddy's working, please leave him alone.
When he came back from Sark in 1949, he found a job teaching at the Central School of Art, and he worked for Maurice Kestelman, who was a great friend of his, very loyal to him. He taught 2 or 3 days a week. This was the staple, this was the bread and butter, really until he was unable to continue working in the early 1960s.
He couldn't cope with the kind of financial side of life. The organisational side, I think that Maeve had to do an awful lot to keep the family together, to see that you had enough groceries for the children to have breakfast, that sort of thing, that the gas bill was paid. Mervyn was an innocent in those respects, and he didn't mind. I mean, as far as he was concerned, but it didn't really matter much. They were not the important things of life.
Maeve, 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 Maeve. Sweetheart, little plum cake, little daisy chain, Claire's mother, darling sweetheart and companion of all our ups and downs. I adore you.
Once he picked me up from school, where he was rather popular with all the nuns who were very fond of him, and he came to pick me up in his Land Rover, and I was sitting next to him, and when he got home he realised that I wasn't next to him anymore, and went back to look for me, and I was found near the school where I had slight concussion. I'd fallen out of the car, but he hadn't noticed, and I went back home and was put to bed, and a doctor was called, and my mother was the crossest I've ever seen with him, and he looked very sheepish and terribly ashamed and terribly upset.
Feeling more and more aggrieved that the money was still not coming in, and longing to provide a better life for Maeve, Peake started to produce work that was overtly commercial. He was convinced that he could make his fortune in the theatre, and wrote a play, The Wit to Woo.
When he produced a thing and he took it to theatrical people, they would hum and ha, or someone would say, all right, we'll pay you a limited sum of money, it'll be ours for the asking, first asking. And he found that he got nowhere. Quite distinguished directors and actors would be keen because he was so imaginative. They could see that he had something that was rare, but also they were nervous of putting it across. That worked at him very heavily, and I'm sure it contributed to his misery.
In 1956, Laurence Olivier, having at first expressed great interest in the play, eventually sent Peake a brutal rejection.
But I must honestly tell you that, in my opinion, I do not believe it quite makes the necessary grade.
Financially, things were always terrible. We never had any money. And I think he found that incredibly hard. He wanted to bring up his family and support them, and he felt in some way he'd failed, even though he worked so hard. I think nothing seemed to go terribly well for him in that way. He didn't seem to get the recognition for his work. And I think then Belson, then writing this play that didn't go down terribly well, I think all of that hurt him very much.
Peake had started to write Titus Alone, but was having difficulty. For no apparent reason, his hands had started to shake, and he found it hard to concentrate.
To north, south, east or west, turning at will, it was not long before his landmarks fled him.
I was about 14, and well, I remember him. I remember being conscious of his movements slowing down, particularly at the table, eating a meal, and I remember looking at his hands cutting up his food, and sort of going. Things were done in very sort of slow ways, and I remember thinking, why is that happening? So that went on for quite a while before I was told or knew that he was becoming ill. I thought it was, well, I didn't know what it was. But then that accumulated, and one day in 1956 I was descending the stairs at this big house in South London, and he was in the hallway, and he was standing up, and he fell over because his legs locked. They just sort of, he went to make a forward movement, and his legs locked, and he just fell over with a short cry, and that was that for me is that particular day is the moment it really started.
Where is he now, Titus the abdicator? Come out of the shadows, traitor, and stand upon the wild brink of my brain.
After 5 years of doing the rounds, The Wit to Woo was finally produced in March 1957. Peake was elated.
I remember the first night of The Wit to Woo at the Arts Theatre, and my mother and father getting ready for that evening, and my father having hired a suit and looking terribly smart, and my mother having a new dress on, looking beautiful. And I remember them going off very excitedly with friends, and then I went to bed, and I woke up in the morning and saw my father sitting sort of halfway out of his studio in a big old leather chair with what seemed like lots of people around him, which was probably just my mother and a doctor and friends, and he was shaking uncontrollably and in a terrible state. Everybody looked terribly worried around him, and my mother saw me and sent for my brothers to take me out for the day, which they did. Later on I found out that in fact what had happened that night was that they'd come home and gone for a wonderful dinner and read the reviews, waited for the reviews, and they'd been indifferent and not awful, not wonderful, but indifferent. And I think my father just felt that was it.
Where everyone is eccentric, nobody is funny, because there is no norm against which to measure them. Mr. Peake overreaches himself, verbally implies that a seldom as good as the best.
Manfully prepared to make the best of a farce without style, we are inflicted in the end with a fantasy marred by a bogus
Of
style.
letting storytelling go hang and relying for his effects on incidental decorations.
The play closed with takings of something like 47 quid or something for the playwright. And Peake had been basing so much hope on this that it seems that caused another of what I think were these depressive or fugal episodes. And he appears to have had major episodes of insanity after the failure of the play.
He said, the doctor, that he was proud to meet me. I think he knows my work. A Chinese has just come into our ward. Maybe he'll speak Mandarin. God bless you. All will come right and we will storm the citadels together. This is going to be a great spring in our lives.
I knew he had to go off for longish periods to have treatment, which he hated, because he had this electrical ECT treatment, which he abhorred, and every time that he was due to go there, he would talk to me and tell me how much he loathed it. It really hurt him.
I have had 4 electric treatments. I don't like them much, but I believe they do good. Oh, days, days, roll along. Tell the children I love their letters. I long for my family again. God bless you. God bless all of you. From your own husband, Mervyn.
Heads float about me, come and go, absorb me, terrify me that they deny the nightmare that they should be, defy me, and all the secrecy, the horror of truth, of this intrinsic truth drifting, our God, along the corridors of the world, hearing the metal clang and the rolling wheels. Heads float about me, haunted by solitary sorrows.
Although Peake had been treated for a nervous breakdown, by now it was clear that he was also suffering from a physical illness. He had aged dramatically. He had severe Parkinson's disease and was showing signs of mental deterioration. He struggled to continue writing his final book.
The manuscripts themselves are a terrible mess, and in some places very sad. I mean, I remember in places you will get the same paragraph appearing over and over again, as though his mind has got into a loop. So he was seriously ill. The illness was causing him grave difficulties in the later stages of writing that book. It's extraordinary that he managed to finish it, I think.
There burned the ritual, all he had lost, all he had searched for, the concrete fact of it, the proof of his own sanity and love. Oh God, it's true, it's true. I am not mad, I am not mad, he cried. Gormenghast, his home. He could feel it, he could almost see it. He had only to skirt the base of the great rock or climb its crusty crown for his eyes to become filled with towers. There was a taste in the air of iron. There was a quickening, it seemed, of the very stones and of the bridgeless spaces. What was he waiting for?
We were expecting a 3rd volume. We'd known for some years that he was working on it, and also that he was having some difficulty and that his mind was beginning to go. And when it came quite suddenly. His wife, Maeve, brought him in one day with the manuscript and delivered it. I thought that if I made suggestions about tightening it up and altering and cutting the parts that seemed to me to need attention, he would at any rate be able to deal with that and to say yes or no and to write some short linking passages in a fairly routine way. But in fact I was wrong. He had in fact gone well beyond that. He was no longer capable of doing even elementary work of that kind.
A drastic experimental brain operation in 1960 only accelerated Peake's decline. The illness which eventually killed him was never conclusively diagnosed, but may have been a rare neuropsychiatric disorder that he had caught as a child in China.
He went away to a mental home, I think, and Mrs. Peake went and visited him every week. And when I met her, they lived then in Drayton Gardens, and I said, "How is he?" And she said, "He's terrible. He can't do a thing for himself." So he just sat there in a wheelchair, and he never spoke. And she visited him every weekend until he died.
Did he even know that he was the person that had written those books?
No, in the last year or two, he was past that stage. He wasn't in a different world. He just wasn't aware of what really was going on. Breakfast was at 9 o'clock and a bit of lunch at 12:30. Lights out 6:30. It was a routine, like incarceration, with old folks dribbling. Not an attractive end for somebody who, if one turned the clock back for a very short time, was in the middle of his period of talent. After all, 49 is hardly very old.
Out of the overlapping leaves of my brain came tapping, tapping, a voice that is not mine alone, nor can the woodpecker claim it as his own. The flicker deep in the foliage belongs to neither birds, men, or dreams. It is as far away as childhood seems.